pleasure to speak to you all about some historical research I've been doing over the past couple of years. And I'm going to focus today on some history related to Joggins. And because some of you may not have been to Joggins, I guess I want to start the talk by positioning us there. So Joggins Fossil Cliffs is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I'm going to mute the iPhone, whoever's iPhone that is, if I can. Yeah, so it has now a wonderful interpretive center in the little town of Joggins, right on the cliffs there. Amazing exhibit gallery display and a place where people can come and learn about the fossils that are found in this spot at Joggins. And yeah, so I wanted to, this is going to be a historical talk about this place, and I guess I wanted to start with some modern history. So I think the sort of this current era starts with Don Reed opening his Joggins Fossil Center in 1989. So there's Don standing or sitting next to his famous Joggins tree stump. And there was a lot of work from John Calder and Deb Skilder, who is the curator of the museum here, and Ken Adams at Fundy, and a lot of community members put in the proposal, and Joggins became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008. And from that time period, there's been an amazing group of people that have come about and done work. So Melissa Gray was the curator until recently, when Jade is now filling that role. Matt Stimson started as a student, and he's now an acting geologist with the New Brunswick Museum. And Regan Maloney was also started as an interpreter, is now at the Fundy Geological Museum. So just an amazing group of people have come about from the Joggins site since it was made a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008. And just last year, Joggins is now featured at the Royal Ontario Museum, a new exhibit, Dawn of Life Gallery. And there is Don Reed's tree stump on display, and there's going to be 1 million people a year seeing that stump, learning about Joggins, and hopefully wanting to come to Nova Scotia. So that's the sort of current history, and now I just want to sort of dive back in time. A lot of this work is informed by work that John Calder's already done. He published a great paper, History of Science paper, the Coal Age Galapagos. And I'm going to sort of revisit some of his topics, but also add a few new ones. I'm not going to talk about Williams College visit. That was also published by Falcon Lang in 2009. That's a really great bit of history of science, the first geology field trip that came to Nova Scotia. But I'm going to talk about Lyell and Gesner in 1842, a visit by Marsh in 1854, and then subsequent topics all the way down to stopping at International Geological Congress, visiting in 1913. Just a quick check to make sure everyone can hear me okay. Andrew, give me a thumbs. Okay, good. Thank you. This is the first published geological map of Nova Scotia. It was produced by Charles Jackson and Francis Algier, and from Boston. They were geologists traveling up into Nova Scotia over a series of 3 or 4 years. This is a beautiful map that really lays out just the high-end geology of the region. So this is sort of setting the stage, providing the context, and topics. Again, if you've not been to Nova Scotia, just want to let you know where things are. So Halifax, located on the Atlantic coast; Windsor, on the southern side of the Minas Basin; Cape Blomidon is also in the Minas Basin; Parsbro, and Joggins up there at the top. Another view, another map, another historical map from this one from 1855, and just going to zoom into that Minas Basin area again showing you those 5 locations: Halifax, Windsor, Blomidon, Parsbro and Joggins. So if you wanted to go from Halifax to Windsor, Halifax to Joggins, in this time period, you would take the road that went from Halifax to Windsor. And you would get on a boat and wait for the proper tides, and you would take a schooner across the Minas Basin to Parsbro, and then get on your horse or mail carriage or walk, and then take the road to Joggins. So that was the route connecting these 5 different spots. So the story starting in 1842 was really identified by Dawson as being, Dawson recognized, he wrote the Acadian Geology published in 1855, and he starts that by saying 1842 was like a new era for Nova Scotia geology, because this is when Charles Lyell visited Nova Scotia. Both Charles and his wife Mary visited for a month. So Charles Lyell was a really big deal at the time. So he had published the Principles of Geology in the 1830s, and from that work was invited to tour North America, and he went to Boston and gave several lectures. So here you see him standing there with his pointer, and if anyone wonders what PowerPoint is about, so that's his pointer there, pointing to his drawings on the wall, and there's a mastodon, big drawing of a mastodon on the left-hand side. So people would come and hear him talk about these different geological lectures. On his way back in 1842, he decided to stop in Nova Scotia. So here's the Acadian Recorder newspaper from July 23rd, 1842. And the page 3 has the list of passengers that have just come in the previous week. And on the end of that second line, you see Mr. and Mrs. Lyell among the passengers from Boston to Halifax. So they actually arrived the Sunday before, but it showed up in the paper on the 23rd. We also know about his trip to Nova Scotia because he wrote about it extensively, and this Travels of North America was published in 1845. So not only is he coming and doing this research, but he's promoting and telling people about what he's seeing. And this is a really significant thing for geotourism as well. So in the second volume, he starts and describes how he arrived. Him and his wife Mary arrived on July 16th. And then he basically tells the story of where they went and what they saw. And so coming off the boat in Halifax, they then took a quick trip to Point Pleasant Park to see the glacial striations that are visible there. And this photo is actually from 1873, the oldest photo I've been able to find of the site. But Charles Lyell would have been there and went explicitly to see those glacial striations. Because there was still debate going on about was it glacial or was it iceberg drift that was causing these surface geology features. From Halifax, he took that road to Windsor, and he met Dr. Harding, and they walked along the Bay of Fundy, and he collected these footprints of birds walking in the Bay of Fundy mud, and he carved them out and dried them, and some of these samples are still at University of Edinburgh. So this was really important. He was making observations in the modern world and looking for ways that interpreted, or how he could interpret the geological or fossil record from what he saw in the modern world. And the Bay of Fundy played an important role in all of that. So from Windsor, he then describes at Wolf Hill, he hired a schooner and headed over the Basin of Mines is what it was called at the time. Now we call Minas Basin. So this wasn't published by Dawson, but this is about the same time. This is 1842 from Canadian Scenery, Volume 2. There's a Cape Blomidon and Parsbro. So someone in a schooner from Windsor on their way to Parsbro across the shore there. So there's a depiction of Cape Blomidon, this famous mineral collecting site. So he goes on to spend many, many pages talking about his trip to Nova Scotia in the Travels to North America. And he also published for the first time this figure, 18, that shows the cliffs at South Joggins and near Minuti, Nova Scotia. And he also went on, I just put it in this other page here, he also has this story about how when he was there and leaving, he came up to some locals and asked if his friends had already left and gone by, and they said, yeah, they went by on horseback. And he asked about the origin of the word name Joggins, and the locals suggested to him it was because the shore jogged in and out. So just a little bit of interesting insights about how he's learning about the landscape from the people that he's interacting with in the area. So some new work that I've been doing is I've been really excited to see that the University of Edinburgh has purchased his notebooks. And I just want to check to make sure my camera shows people on the right-hand side. Is everyone able to see like the full picture on the right-hand side with the notebook? Someone, yeah, okay. Yeah, so these notebooks were purchased, 294 notebooks, his field books that he had, and I was just patiently waiting for number 104 to be digitized. And just about a month and a half ago, I guess it was, and I just dropped everything and started looking through it. So here's the index from the back of his book. After he's written all his notes, he goes through and figures out what's of importance. And it's basically much of his trip to Nova Scotia, who he talked to, what he saw, his little diagrams and notes. So there's still lots of work to do to go through this and really understand the importance of it. But certainly one of the most prominent things that really jumped out at me was on page 48. And you see this pencil drawing in the middle and his notes below it, which I'm sure you can't read, but I've gotten used to reading Charles Lyell's reading. So there it is. He says, the gypsum scene and a limestone about half of a mile south of the village of Minuti, the dip carrying the beds under the coal cliffs on the west bank of the Hebert River. So this is his significant observation, that he's noting that gypsum are located underneath the beds of the gypsum of the trees, the fossil forest, that the gypsum is older than the fossil forest. And he actually took, there was a disagreement between Lyell and Gesner, who also accompanied him, Abraham Gesner accompanied him on this trip, and this was a major source of contention. Gesner really still didn't buy into this. But I also want you to see, so his original pencil drawing is in the middle, and then on top of it is a reversed image. The writing is still the way it should be, but he's turned the diagram. The pencil drawing below is basically looking from east to west, and the pen drawing from on the top is looking at it from the water side, but he wasn't on the water. Maybe he was like for the low tide, but he's flipped that in pen and drawn in pen later. And that is the actual sketch of what then became published in Figure 18 of Travels in North America, this really famous drawing of the first drawing of Joggins fossil cliffs. So this notebook's just a treasure trove of things, and still lots of work to do to go through. So moving on to the next important journey to Nova Scotia is Charles Marsh, who was a famous dinosaur paleontologist at the Peabody Museum, the Marsh and Cope dinosaur wars. Many people would know that. Very, very prolific dinosaur paleontologist. But it turns, as it turns out, when he was in college in 1851 to 55, so he's 20 years old, 24 years old, he was actually more interested in minerals. And he was at the Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. And because he was interested in minerals, he actually spent 4 summers in Nova Scotia collecting minerals. And amazingly, two of his diaries, personal diaries, are available at the archives. And I've looked through both of these. So the first one from 1851 doesn't really talk about Nova Scotia. but 1854 is just a treasure trove of geological travel knowledge. So just starting off, sharing some of the sort of high-level insights from this. So the journal starts on September 1st, 1854, and he says that he's just gotten back the Monday before from a 5-week vacation in Nova Scotia collecting minerals, and he was very successful. So he spent all of August and part of July in Nova Scotia in 1854. I don't have any description writings of, he hasn't described that in this particular diary. But he does mention that he was there in 54. And I'm going to try to make that smaller. So then he goes on 2 weeks later, he says he's purchased Halliburton's Yankee Stories and a couple other books for his school. And he's read several chapters of Halliburton's book, which he enjoyed because he had met Halliburton when he was here, and he was familiar with the people and localities that Halliburton refers to in those Sam Slick stories. He then later, so then he's gone to school, and in the next summer describes in detail his trip to Nova Scotia that summer. So in getting ready to leave Boston, they went down to the harbor and getting ready to board the schooner. The schooner's name was Trial, and the captain was Spencer. Captain Spencer, bound for Londonderry. But they were going to be put ashore in Parsborough, and the vessel didn't sail that evening, so they went to see learn these talking canaries, or performing canary birds, and they had a good time waiting for the fog to lift. The fog eventually did lift. It was a few days, but they then got on their way, and so August 5th, in his notes, he's talking about on Friday or Saturday morning, they sailed past Isle Hut and into the Bay of Fundy, and he's feeling at home. The whole coast, he's become very familiar with it, and is enjoying his trips to the Minas Basin. But he then tells us stories as they came around they went by Cape Split and saw the riptides, but as they came around Partridge Island shore, and they're getting ready to get off, their baggage was ready, this huge gust of wind came and struck the ship, which had its sails all set still, and nearly tipped it over. He was quite scared that he might not survive. But at last they got the ship turned around, and everyone departed and were waving their handkerchiefs as everyone left. So it's really amazing diary talking about who he's meeting. He then gets off at Partridge Island and goes up to the Ottawa House, where he stayed much of his time there. And he goes on, I want to share this entry where he has commissioned a mail coach, so a horse-drawn carriage, to go up to Amherst with the family from the Ottawa House. The family and he are going to attend the bazaar, or the fair that's in Amherst. I've not been able to find any newspaper articles or descriptions of what that fair was like in Amherst. They had a pleasant ride, a good driver, and so he and his friend William Park, who was also at college, who was also there with him on this trip, left everyone in Amherst and walked to the Cumberland coal mines. And they would meet them in Amherst again. So they walked 14 miles through pleasant country, mostly woods, in which mosquitoes and blueberries were very plenty. So you get the idea of what travel was like. They've taken a horse-drawn carriage up to Amherst, and then they walked for 14 miles to get to Joggins. He spent the next day, he and William Park, around the mines and on the beach collecting fossils that were in great abundance. Now you have to remember, he's more of a mineralogist. So this is sort of the first time he's been to Joggins. He's not super interested in fossils. He's more of a mineral person. But they see whole trees embedded in the cliffs, thin bark, limbs, perfectly distinguishable limbs of the trees. And he notes that Lyell and Silman had visited the locality before. Mr. Boggs, the agent of the mines, helped them. And Marsh notes that in the evening, they packed up their fossils and left them with Boggs to ship back to Boston. And then they walked 3 miles to Lower Cove and eventually met up with the group back in Amherst. So this is significant in that it's describing that he and William Park collected the fossils and left them with Boggs, who then looked after sending them to him in Boston. So you just have to imagine these rocks, wrapped in newspaper, in a shipping, a shipping box, a trunk. And Mr. Boggs is sort of in charge of it. And why that's significant is of the fossils that Marsh apparently collected, he published in 1862 a description, and it was a really big deal at the time, of these 2 vertebrae that he says were found at Joggins, and he named them Eosaurus acadianus. So this early reptile, these large vertebrae of an early reptile. And it set off a controversy in terms of later work, then recognizing that these aren't actually from Joggins. They look like ichthyosaur vertebrae, marine reptiles, more commonly found by Mary Anning and everyone on the Lyme Regis coast. So it was during that trip that he apparently found these, and I just, where everyone is trying to figure out, is still trying to figure out why he got these confused to be in Joggins. John Calder, through a letter he received from Donald Baird and sort of the group at Yale, their story was that Marsh was given the vertebra by the captain who told him that he found them at Joggins. But my attention is drawn to Mr. Boggs, this agent of the mines who was in charge of packing up and shipping them to Boston. Boggs may have had some fossils that he thought Marsh would be interested in, and it would be maybe easy to think that they would just be wrapped in paper and put in with the other things and shipped to him. And certainly if Marsh had found a vertebra of that significance, you would think he would note it in his diary. So that's been a bit of a mystery. And then another sort of recent discovery I made is at the Yale archives, in Marsh's archive at Yale, I found this letter from David Honeyman, who is the first curator of the Nova Scotia Museum, who I've been doing a lot of research on. So this is from 1870, 2 years after the Nova Scotia Museum was formed. And Honeyman is writing to Marsh and actually asking him if he would send him part of the vertebra of Eosaurus acadianus. And he says, I have no doubt Nova Scotia government will allow me to make exchanges with you if he would do that. As far as I know, there was no reply, but really interesting to see this early letter from David Honeyman advocating that he's trying to get these specimens back. And then also doing other historical work here at the museum in Halifax, I found these vertebrae, which David Honeyman talks about in his writing, and he describes that he purchased these or acquired these when he was in London at the 1862 International Exhibition. So these ichthyosaur vertebrae look an awful lot. Now, there are notable differences, but they look very similar in general orientation and structure to Eosaurus vertebrae. The Eosaurus vertebrae, I believe, are still at Yale, so I don't think these are the same thing, but just interesting to note that when David Letterman wrote that letter, he had among his specimens things that he thought look similar. So that's the story of Marsh and Eosaurus acadianus. The third story is of Thomas Weston and sort of the first photographs of the Joggins fossil cliffs. We have the drawing done by Lyell, but so Thomas Weston worked for the Canadian Geological Survey, and he had several trips to Nova Scotia. And he writes about them in his memoirs, The Reminiscences of Among the Rocks, which is a really neat read if anyone is interested in Nova Scotia geology history. And he mentions there that on this trip in 1879, he had been down in Lunenburg Way, he went fishing, and there's this amazing photo of him with this huge tuna. But then he was coming back through Halifax. He met with his friend, David Honeyman, who he had met 3 years before at the Centennial exhibition. And while he was on his way back, he heard from Ottawa and was requested to stop in at Joggins to take photographs to illustrate a paper that William Dawson was writing for the Society. So he does that and returns on July 20th. Unfortunately, the Canadian Geological Survey Archives doesn't have the photo, but the photo was the source of this lithograph, which is an early depiction of Coal Mine Point at South Joggins from 1879. And it does say it was from a photograph of Weston. So just blowing that up there. And there is someone standing there. And Weston always did include his local person that would act as his guide. He had them there as a sort of a scale bar. So we're still sort of looking for this original photo, but this lithograph was the published version of it. We do have other photographs of Weston that took during that trip in July. So this is from the porch probably of the mine office. So you see the Joggins, the tree stumps just stacked there among the porch. And this depiction of the chute going down and down to the dock and a boat there at low tide, the Joggins strata in the background. So these are the earliest photographs that I've been able to find of the Joggins fossil cliffs. And we'll come back to this photo in a little bit. There was other trips after Lyell and Marsh as things really picked up. And MIT geology department actually came several times. So they came in 1879 and 1884 and 1894. And as part of these trips, for the students were in charge of writing a detailed log. It was basically their project. They had to describe what they saw. So these are available in the MIT archives, and I've been able to look through them. They're, again, really rich sources of who people saw and also who was on these trips. And it's interesting to think about what careers they might have then had. On the left-hand side here, we also see the third circular describes what people should bring. They should bring a hat, a flannel shirt, undershirts, 1 cake of soap, a woolen blanket, all these different things. So really neat historical record of what it was like to do a field trip at the time. So 1884, there's a really great descriptions and some drawings. But 1894 is when it really, that report is really, really great, because we also not only have the report, we have the newspaper articles of the time that describe who was here and what they were. So MIT is starting to get a reputation for coming to Nova Scotia and exploring the geology, and Joggins was always one of those stops. And also in that 1894 report, we see these photographs of the students and the faculty at the rocks at Point Pleasant Park in Halifax, looking at the glacial striations again. Waverly, panning for gold. This is 1894. There's about 15 or 20 of these photographs of different geology sites all over Nova Scotia. But it also includes Joggins. So this is the head of the mine with a group, and of one of the faculty or students up on the cliff, standing, doing the famous pose with the tree stump, geology hammer in hand. So not the oldest photos of Joggins, but certainly really interesting and very historic photos of geological visits to Nova Scotia, and that's MIT. So the other sort of level, not university level field trips, but this is now international field trips. So this is this part of the story is about British Association of Science meeting that was held in Montreal in 1884. It's the first time the British Association of Science held their meeting outside of the London, UK, and they came to Montreal, but they also did an excursion to the Atlantic provinces, to Nova Scotia. And that is actually quite well described or written up. So here's a new map, different from the 1855. Now you're seeing the railway network on the map. This is the map, I think, is from 1887, but basically shows you the time. And from the various reports that we have of this trip, a small group of folks were met in Amherst, and David Honeyman acted as the sort of the field guide. They met the train in Amherst, then took a train down to McCann, and then a horse and buggy ride to Joggins. So that's on September 20th. They then horse and buggy ride back to McCann and a train to Spring Hill Mines, where they spent the day, and then down to Parsboro. So the Spring Hill Mine train down to Parsboro, that was quite a new thing that year. So they were sort of showing that off. They then boarded the ferry at Ottawa House, Partridge Island, on Monday and steamed across on Tuesday, passing again Blomidon, cliffs at Blomidon, and spending some time in Windsor looking at the gypsum, and then a special train down to Halifax, where again the group saw the famous glacial striations in Halifax. So this trip that started in Joggins is really well described. Honeyman wrote about who was there, and so it's the president of the geological section of the British Association of Science, Dr. Blandford, Mr. Belly he's more of a chemist from University College of Oxford, but the premier and the future premier are there. Mr. Gilpin, the manager of Spring Hill Mines, a professor from Dow, professor from Amherst, and 3 reporters and David Honeyman. And so the 3 reporters being there and the very political audience of this trip, this article in the Morning Herald from September 23rd, I just did a word count on it, is 4,000 words long. It's a really amazing description of what they got up to. And some of it was some shenanigans. So remember that photo of the chute going down, there's the description in the story that they were actually, getting on that chute and riding these coal chutes down at high speed. Some of them didn't want to do it. And the MIT journals also describe getting in these coal chutes and riding these things down. So if Joggins is ever thinking about an experiential tourism thing, maybe a zip line down to the shore and recreating this thing, because people have been doing it for a long time. So the descriptions are really quite amazing, and they're ending their trip at Joggins, and Blandford did collect some fossils. He thought he found something quite significant, but turned out not to be. But just a little snippet from that article. So the journey back to McCann was devoted to the cultivation of musical gifts. So they're just singing in the cart back and drive back to McCann, and David Honeyman, ex-premier, and a couple others doing the best of the singing. So a pretty joyous and raucous time they seem to have had at Joggins. And so that's an international and sort of political field trip. And sort of the last story I wanted to share, and some new research bringing to this, is the International Geological Congress in 1913. So this is a really big deal. This is not just the British Association. This is like geologists from all over the world coming to in this case, Montreal and Ontario, but there was this field trip to Eastern Quebec in the Maritime Province, and it's really well described in the field books. The geology is really, really well described, has, new geology field maps. So these are everyone, major geologists from all over the world are coming to tour the geology sites of Nova Scotia. And we all have published names of who was there, and I've just highlighted a few that I wanted to point out. So a lot of Canadian important people. So Walter Bell in Canada, Barrows is one of those MIT folks. Jennison is a local churro geologist. He just had published the report on the gypsum. The museum curator at the time, Harry Piers, is there. And Charles Schuchert from Yale, who we'll talk about in a second, is also there. And I also highlighted, just noted that Miss Rathjen, so she's the only woman geologist from Germany who came at the time, was there too. So that's a photo of there. So just really interesting group of people that have come to the area and are touring around. And again, they're largely taking trains to these different locations. They stopped here at Arisag with this photo. And so Charles Schuchert at Yale, his field book, just like Charles Lyell's notebook, is in the archives, and I've had a digital copy made, and I've been looking at that. It's really interesting descriptions of what he was seeing, and he also was taking his own photos, and in that field book are the photos that he was given by the Geological Survey of Canada. And this photo is one of those. So it's from around 1890. It's produced by the GSC, so sort of like a Weston photo. I'm not sure who actually took it, but this photo then went on to become really important for Nova Scotia, because it was the one that was featured on postcards through the war years, starting in 1911 through until the end of the Second World War, and it's being tagged with the land of Evangeline. So the geology photo of Blomidon, taken because of its geological features, is being co-opted and used as the backdrop for tourism and the branding of Nova Scotia as the land of Evangeline. So exact same photo, repurposed for many years. So back to the International Geological Congress of 1913. So Charles Schuchert's notes, and they are quite scratchy in this copy. In the PowerPoint isn't super great, but he's basically just talking about the different fossils he's found. So sigillarian trees and calamites, and seeing everything in its place. There are some photos that he has of everyone down on the beach, and of himself, not at Joggins, but in this case, down the shore more towards Parsborough. So these photos of folks on the beach, when they were down there, they were given lunch at low tide. And so these became really, really famous depictions of this trip of the International Geological Congress to Joggins. Really, some of them really high quality, and you get to get a feel of what it was like to be among the group, traveling around, looking at the rocks, finding the fossils. And yeah, so just sort of now thinking about, want to jump back to the future, and when we see the true success of this dining on the ocean floor at Burnt Coat Head, and booking for next year is $1,500 for a couple. This gourmet, really amazing meal at low tide, and you see where that whole notion really started back in 1913. But the sandwiches were probably a little less flavorful than what you might be able to experience at Burnt Coat Head these years. But again, you see in 1913 the horse-drawn carriage, and the cameramen there taking their photos of the group. So that 1913 trip is still something that we can explore through the notes of Charles Schuchert and others. So that's been my journey through some of these, or summary of some of these historical journeys to Joggins, starting with Lyell in 42 and Marsh in 1855. The first photos by Weston in 1879, the British Association meeting in 1884, MIT through the years, but this really amazing group of photos from 1894 and stopping with the 1911 or 1913. So 1914, the whole situation changes. First World War, basically through until the Second World War, Nova Scotia really there was not a lot of advances in geology or visits. So, and understandably, but a really interesting time to think about what role that Joggins had played over those years. And so that's all I have to share with you so far, but just wanted to maybe highlight that next year will be the 15th anniversary of UNESCO World Heritage Site at Joggins. So start planning your trip and join the history of these historic journeys to Joggins, and hope to see you in Nova Scotia next year. And that's all I have.